What is the fastest growing illegal business in the world? Put differently, what is one of the most sought after commodities on the black market? Human flesh, specifically the flesh of women and children. Human trafficking has become the fastest growing illegal business on the planet, and it's second only to the drug trade. And U.S. demand for cheap labor and cheap sex drastically exacerbates any solutions to the problem. Now, as a student, I've been fortunate in both undergrad and in law school to be introduced to issues that I was otherwise unaware of. More recently, I worked for the Rutgers International Human Rights Clinic, and there we researched the laws that protect and advocate for human trafficking victims here in the United States. Now, much of this talk stems from that research, as well as being introduced to the experts in the field. Now, there are three things I want you to take away from today's talk. The first is to be able to answer the following question: what is human trafficking? And the second is to understand that human trafficking happens everywhere, even in Jersey City. And the third and most important is to understand that the issues that underlie the causes of human trafficking are uniquely tied to every single one of us. Now, part of this talk does stem from a conversation I had with a friend. And in that conversation, I was explaining to him what one does for a clinic. In doing so, I was rattling off a number of statistics, like that there's 27 million trafficking victims in the world, and that 98% of those trafficked for sexual exploitation are women and girls. And on I went. At some point, he stops me, and he says, "Why should I care?" Now, needless to say, I was irritated. I was upset at a very simple truth, that people tend not to care about things they can't see the effects of. Now, I came to understand that my friend wasn't so much expressing an inherent insensitivity to the plight of these individuals, but was instead expressing in less words, why should I concern my busy life with an issue that doesn't affect me? So with that, I came to understand that through sympathetic understanding and awareness of both the legal and social issues, the average American can positively impact what has become the worst human rights violation: slavery. So what is human trafficking? First, let me highlight just how prevalent this issue has become. In July of this year, the International Labor Organization estimated that human trafficking is a $150 billion a year industry. Now, in 2005, that same report estimated it at $30 billion a year. That's a 500% increase in less than a decade. Now, this highlights two issues, among a number of others, but two that we'll talk about today. One, that 10 years ago, we lacked the statistical information in order to accurately determine how severe this problem is. And two, the war on drugs and other government initiatives has caused these perpetrators to seek an alternative means of income or an alternative product. So what constitutes human trafficking? One commits the crime of human trafficking when they recruit, transport, harbor, or obtain an individual by threat or use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of exploitation, either sexual exploitation, forced labor, removal of organs, things of this nature. So, the question becomes at this point, why does it happen here in the U.S.? Now, the U.S. that definition is the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. The U.S. took its own steps, and they implemented the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Now, the TVPA defines sex trafficking as commercial sex act induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the individual who is forced to commit such an act has not yet reached the age of 18 years. Now, the sex industry utilizes a number of different venues in the United States, namely, aside from street prostitution, namely residential brothels, massage parlors, strip clubs, and online escort services. TVPA also defines labor trafficking. Now, labor trafficking is the recruitment, transportation, harboring, or providing of an individual by force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of labor exploitation. You should start to see a trend here at some point. And so in the U.S., there are a number of industries that are most susceptible to utilizing forced labor, namely agriculture, the restaurant and catering industry, commercial, as well as residential, domestic work, and then textile and garment industries, specifically factories. Now, the International Labor Organization recognizes that nearly 90% of all forced labor happens in the private economy. Many of these industries will actually utilize forced labor without realizing that they are doing so. Case in point, in 2010, the Department of Justice issued an indictment alleging that Global Horizons, a labor recruitment company, had recruited 400 Thai workers and forced them to work in the agricultural field in 13 different states. And they did so by confiscating their passports and visas, by having them accrue a substantial debt, and by deporting those who didn't cooperate with the company's demands. So why does this happen? Why does human trafficking occur? And it's honestly pretty simple. Like any commodity, the purchase and sale of some item, even human flesh, is based off of supply and demand. The bad guys of the world wouldn't be selling people if it wasn't lucrative to do so. And it wouldn't be lucrative if there wasn't a demand. And the fact is, American industry is insatiable. And that has its positives, but it also has its negatives. Because at the end of the day, American demand is what drives the supply of human trafficking. And American demand is what causes human trafficking in the United States, as well as in a number of other countries. So this takes me to goal number 2. Goal number 2 is to take the issue of human trafficking away from the international context and down to the national, and even more specifically, at the local level. So in 2009, then Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Antonio Costa, introduced a report by that organization with a letter titled, "A Knowledge Crisis About a Crime That Shames Us All." Now I'll quote him for a minute, because in it he states, "We lack a global understanding of the subject and how its components interact as a whole." He then compares that to drug control policies, stating that the drug control policies take into account data concerning the entire value-added chain of all drugs in all markets. Drug information is organized so that policies can target the whole and any of its parts. He then highlights the information or lack of information that we currently have on human trafficking, saying that we must but cannot catalog the different types of slavery. Exploitation through child begging in Europe is different from what happens on a street corner or in a brothel in Australia. Preventative measures must be adopted, taking into account that an Asian father sells his underage daughter under circumstances different from what forces an African teenager into a ragtag army of killers, or what pushes an illegal immigrant into a sweatshop in the Americas. So there are a number of hurdles that affect each and every country. And Mr. Costa's comments are meant to point out that we have to take human trafficking within each country's, more specifically each municipality's unique set of circumstances. The hurdles that affect every single country and city are a lack of statistical information and a lack of legal and law enforcement understanding. Now, in 2013, in the summer of 2013, New Jersey decided to update its human trafficking laws. However, in doing so, they left out certain provisions that would have otherwise made New Jersey safer, namely in the area of business entity liability. Now, as is evident by the Global Horizons case, businesses can utilize forced labor without realizing that they are doing so. And without the proper liability being placed on businesses to be aware of their complex supply chains, we will continue to have an issue with affecting the demand side of human trafficking here in the U.S. Now, one of the major issues here is that we cannot currently identify with the current law whether a business will be held liable for human trafficking. Because as it currently stands, businesses have not been held liable when they engage in, authorize, or willfully ignore issues of human trafficking. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not there and a lawyer couldn't argue it. However, there is a question. And for any of you that are lawyers or no lawyers, you know that a question is all you need to win a case. And that has to be fixed. Now, aside from the legislative inadequacies, the question becomes, what can you do about this? Well, you can do two things. The first is be aware and ask yourself the following question as often as possible. Under what conditions is this person or group of people been employed? And in this way, I ask for 5 seconds of your consciousness when you're acting in your capacity as a consumer. The second thing you can do is call, text, email, post, tweet, whatever method you want, your local and state legislators, and ask them the following 10-word sentence. What are you doing to combat human trafficking in Jersey City? What are you doing to combat human trafficking in your local state, your local county, city, whatever it is? What are you doing to combat human trafficking? Now with that, our court systems are currently inadequately equipped to deal with the complex issues of human trafficking. To combat that, New York City implemented criminal intervention courts for prostitutes. And the way that these work is that when a prostitute is brought in, being arrested, instead of seeing a typical criminal court judge, They are brought before a specialized court designed to deal with possible human trafficking violations and possible human trafficking victims. Now, the point here is that, and as most of you know, prostitution is illegal in the majority of the United States. However, this is not a viewpoint shared by most of the world. The International Labor Organization, for instance, recognizes prostitution as a legitimate form of labor. With that, as do a number of other countries, including Japan and Germany. Now, my goal here is not to actually discuss the efficacy of the U.S. policy, but instead to point to those individuals who have been forced, defrauded, or coerced into taking part in this type of work. Now, this does bring up a moral question, and that moral question is this. The general prohibition on prostitution. Now, like any service industry, prostitution requires that person A, the buyer, receive some service from person B, the seller, in exchange for something of economic value. This particular exchange is illegal in the United States. And we do that because we find that gaining money for this particular service is somehow against our moral integrity. But the question becomes, what about the penalties affected to both parties? In New Jersey, the penalty for person A, the buyer, is a disorderly persons offense, which carries with it a maximum prison sentence of up to 6 months. For the seller, the prostitute, person B, the maximum penalty is up to 18 months, and it's a crime of the 4th degree. My question to you is, why the disparity? Certainly, the only actual difference in these two individuals' actions is that one person gave money and the other person received it. Is the receiving of such greater moral significance that we punish person B 3 times more harshly? Now, in fairness to the law is written in the following way. Person B solicits or requests money from person A, and in that way, as instigator, is somehow morally more culpable or blameworthy. However, is that actually what goes on the ground? In order for person B to fulfill person A's demand, person A has to simultaneously supply. This exchange cannot actually happen without both people participating or supplying. So my question becomes to you, under what conditions do you think person B was employed? Let me put it differently. How likely do you think person A, the buyer, was forced, defrauded, or coerced into buying? Conversely, how likely do you think person B, the seller, the prostitute, was forced, defrauded, or coerced into buying? I don't think the most cynical person in this room would argue that person A is more likely the victim. Anyone here ever heard of a buyer's pimp? The guy out there on the street making sure that you're buying as much sex as you can take, and then some. The fact is that the current policy requires that we have a better method of identifying victims. And as it stands, we do not have that method. But the criminal intervention courts that have been used in New York City, as well as a number of other cities, are one possible method of identifying victims. So the question becomes, why should you care? This goal is simple. As humans, we have a duty to be informed enough that we can demand action from those who are in a place to take it. Mr. Costa finishes his letter with an appeal to the experts, in which he says, I plead with social scientists in academia, and especially in government, to work with the UNODC to generate the logical and statistical categories and information needed for anti-slavery policy. I'm going to finish with a similar appeal to you. Be an informed consumer. Be an activist consumer. Do not let our sons and daughters become victims of this terrible crime. Do not let those individuals who have continued to be oppressed stay that way when you have the power to affect change. Companies work on an easy system, supply and demand. If you demand social responsibility from these individuals, from these companies, they will be forced to supply it. It is not their job to make change. It is your job. The average age at which a girl becomes a prostitute in the United States is between 12 and 14 years old. It also happens to be the average age at which they become a victim of human trafficking. Now, while this may not have been your daughter, she was the daughter of Jersey City. She was a daughter of New Jersey. She was a daughter of the United States. She was a daughter, a son, a brother, a sister, a father, a mother. She was a slave. The slavery of one individual is equal to the slavery of all but one individual. And the quality of slavery is not determined by the number of people enslaved, but by the mere fact that we as a people have allowed its existence. Thank you.